Hi, welcome to our section. My name is Antonio and I'm going to present the full paper that comes from research and projects carried out by the Research Group Laboratory of Frontend Poetics, which operates from the Guinard School and the graduate program in arts and from the State University of Minas Gerais in Brazil. The poetic research that will be exposed here is linked to the research already developed and that are underdeveloped in our group. The group's proposals aim to problematize the various realities: the virtual reality, the managed reality, augmented reality, and social reality, as well as the mixture of these realities known as mixed reality, that integrate with the world as allow us to produce critical ways of interacting, interfering with it. This work proposes regimenting and composing concepts within this sphere of relationship between the pointed realities and the socially constructed reality in the creation of a technological poetic work in an immersive virtual reality. The poetic work of art is an offshoot of an artistic proposal made by artist Froiid, a member of the Laboratory of Frontend Poetics. The artist created a universe parallel to the socially constructed reality, bringing together political and social elements. In Belo Horizonte, Minas Gerais, Froiid created and pursued a speech about the interest and possibility of a group of city people to emancipate or separate part of Minas Gerais, Brazil's territory in the current context. In the LabFront research group, the coordinator formed a team to discuss the extension of this artwork to the field of relations between art and technology. As a result of the poetic work, the interactive installation in immersive virtual reality was generated. It named Emancipação Mineira. The mix between various realities, including those promoted and enhanced by new media, has been discussed for decades in the field of relations between art, science, and technology. It is presented by the artist and theorist Roy Ascott and his research involving telematics, elaborating the junction of the realities pointed by him as validated, virtual, and vegetal. Ascott's ideas echo in the reflections of the field since in the 60s, making it possible to see it today despite already being at the door of another decade of the 21st century. The realization of his propositions deal with the transposition of the common vision of a static one reality for the composition of a multiplicity. This multiplicity is crossed by material elements from the universe of things, as well as from perception, cognition, that is the object and subject of reality whose mode of apprehension is changing. We bring to dialogue in our paper another important author's work that focuses on the transformations of lived reality, especially from the perspective of human biological beings. The reality is a domain of things, and in this sense what can be distinguished is real. Humberto Maturana shows us a reality that is constituted by a process of reification in human language, but which allows being transmuted at this human convention, seeks understanding this domain of things. He realizes that other techniques of seeing enter in this domain, observing and possibly experimenting, seeing, hearing, and interacting. In both dimensions, the reality is seen as an apprehensive perceptive phenomenon built on parts and interaction. The idea of socially constructed reality in Peter Berger and Thomas Luckmann allows us to understand reality from another concept, that of social reality. Existing in society allows one of a constructed of a domain of shared things in a perceptive way that enables, if it can or it is desired, to be transformed more fluidly or less fluidly. With technological advancement, at least there seems to be a change in perception. We may not immediately transform social reality, but we are increasingly intervening in the virtual dimension of reality, including in means such as virtualization with 3D object modeling, for example, augmentation of reality, insertion of objects, reduction of reality, removing of objects. Mixing of these and other ways such as those with holographic characteristics, for example. But in the end, is there really an intervention in social reality composed of an economic and political condition? The ideas of reality are now moving towards what we now have, a social reality of connection managed by various and overlapping moments of circulation. This circulation is commodity producers, global enterprises, immigrants, refugees, all of which is dependent on the degree of symbolic debate to which the people of the world are subject or interested in. We are facing multiple worlds that are moving towards the construction of multiple possibilities to reconstitute reality, including from new foundations of national states in separation movements, such as Afrikaners in South Africa, Kabila in Algeria, Cabinda in Angola, Bakassi in Cameroon, among many others that could be mentioned. But here we have only a few whose names starts with the letters A and C on the vast and diverse African continent. The notion of separation and emancipation is in this idea, so that we do not enter the theory of international law. It will be understood here as the representation of the action of one state that is detached from the domain of another. Obviously, here we do not intend to delve into the conceptual details or theories of international law as to the differences between separation and emancipation, much less especially on the theory of national states and states. We would just like to show that if the present world presents itself from these multiple possibilities of composing social realities, and particular social realities, we have to see that would unite them based on the dimension proposed by Humberto Maturana and Roy Ascott. With Maturana, we could think of a union by the coercive intention of objectification in the domain of things, which is in a conventional universe that biological human beings share. In Ascott, there is a material dimension that has led us to a peculiar technological condition of virtual, validated, and vegetal realities. Unlike the first two, they were built by society in a way as synthetic realities, virtual and validated. The later, the vegetable, has ceased to be a reality accessed only autonomously to be enjoyed widely from the development of science and technology. Plant reality also spreads its constitutive modes throughout the world of the domain of things that can now access reality through this plant bias. For Guy Debord, in his book The Society of Spectacle, society is spectacular. The spectacle is separation. Separation is at this stage of the society of production in the political economy. As we see through the author's thesis, the dimension of alienation of the human being from its own productive force. This separation from Guy Debord made primarily in the productive unity, where the producer is united in production and the separate production process of him, acquired by those who will own the property generated, spreads through the society as parts of his genetics. This dimension of separation creates a reality that allows one to unfold the modes of separation previously restricted only to the universe of production, as pointed out, or that of art, as in the presentation of the show, that's which the actor is not himself as a performance, since now a society of production aesthetics of this production process is founded on separation, as seen in Guy Debord. It is from this configuration that poetic work developed was proposed, opening the possibilities of reviewing realities and building new realities on social conventions that are built within a dimension of separation. Interestingly, both Froid's proposal and interactive installation in immersive virtual reality, whose poetic process will be described later on, are erected in the understanding of the diverse reality and separation. We were aware that precisely because of the diversity of reality and separation, we will be able to compose an artwork with this motto, the separation of a people, and with a composition, the narrative about an utopian movement, that the installation in virtual reality that separates it from reality while putting it in check and debating it. We will now start to show more about the interactive installation. From 2015, the artist Froiid began action in the city of Belo Horizonte, Minas Gerais, Brazil. In this action, they proposed to inaugurate a new territory from the movement from the emancipation of the state of Minas Gerais from the rest of the country. Based on the constant and contrasted international separatist groups such as Brexit, a group calling the separation of the United Kingdom from the rest of the European Union, and the national groups such as São Paulo Livre and Do Sul é Meu País, which appeared with the proposals and referenda in public squares, the artists ostensibly researched what other groups had been strengthening, creating similar movements at the juncture built at the beginning of the 21st century. With the results of this research, the artist decided to create his own emancipation movement, constituting its basis from some assumptions. After learning of the proposal, the Lab Front coordinator proposed to the artist to create the installation development team, including Pablo Gobira, Froiid, and myself. The objective would be to continue the possibilities of production of poetic work by exploring the relationship with the digital technologies. The creation of the installation in immersive virtual reality emerges as a proposal to expand the non-existent reality related to the action scenario developed by the artist in the city of Belo Horizonte. The development took place in two stages. The first made it possible to elaborate the concept and dealt with the aesthetic dimension of the installation, and the second referred to the technical realization and programming of the application that allows the audience and the viewers to enjoy the work. As the Lab Front team realized there was a maze in the emancipation narrative, this was chosen as a way to bring the viewer into a representation of the conflict faced by those who had contact with the artist's actions in the emancipation city. The individuals and the social movements of the city that came into contact with the idea of an emancipatory movement from Minas Gerais even ended up not understanding the demands due to the mismatched discourses. However, this did not mean a lack of credibility to the proposal, including adhesion and motions of support. Many also did not realize the incongruities expressed in the leaflets and the posters, some of them bearing not just regional but national representations. The creation of a maze in which the viewer could walk through this proposal, here already named as Minas Gerais Emancipation or Emancipação Mineira, is related to the illusory and disorientating idea of the possible paths to follow resulting from the non-existent reality in Belo Horizonte. The installation aims through a three-dimensional labyrinthine space to enable the viewer to walk imaginable paths and explore the images produced with fine arts techniques, videos and audios made in the city of Belo Horizonte. All of this happens in a virtual environment with low lighting, with sounds crossing, bringing the obscure dimension that all poetics promote. The poetic work has already shown in the exhibition in Mayo number 10 in Brasilia, the capital of Brazil, in the National Museum during the 70th International Meeting of Art and Technology in 2018, and it was also exhibited during the Sensitive Lines exhibition held in commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the Guinnard School in July and August in 2019 at the State University of Minas Gerais in the gallery of the institution. So now we're going to the end. We just like to thank you for watching, and we would like to invite you to join us on our Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter and YouTube account. Thanks again for your attention. Bye-bye.
Hey everyone, I'm Oliver Bown from UNSW Sydney at the Interactive Media Lab, and this is a presentation with Anthony Rowe and Liam Birtles from Squid Soup. Liam is also from Bournemouth University. So we're talking about creative audio design for a massively multipoint sound and light system. And we're presenting our creative work, Murmuration, that we completed building in November 2019. And Murmuration is an artwork that builds on Squid Soup's previous series of works investigating large-scale media architectures, mostly grid-based light installations, but increasingly working with Internet of Things powered light and sound installations. So what you're seeing here is our first ever iteration of an Internet of Things powered light artwork at Kew Gardens in London called Bloom, and it uses 1,000 Arduino powered lights, each with a built-in simple piezo speaker that was only capable of basic tone production, and these were embedded in a plastic shell, custom made. A later iteration of that work was the wave artwork. This is 450 lights suspended, and in this case it's just another iteration of the system, again Arduino powered, this time using ESP32 boards, and this time using a sample playback hat that enabled sample triggering and playback of sample sounds through each device. And this is Wave in action. This is a creative work that was produced by Squid Soup with sound design by myself and Eve Klein from Queensland in Australia. Here's a quick glimpse of the Murmuration artwork. So the system we're using for Murmuration involved a custom-made ESP32 board with LEDs mounted on the board, attached to a very small speaker with not particularly low bass response, and an SD card built in that could hold 16 gigabytes of audio. And then embedded in a single globe unit with the light emitting around that unit and the speaker embedded in the bottom of the unit. And this system was programmed pretty much as you would program a typical Arduino device with over-the-air deployment of code. So you could basically save your compiled code to a server, and that binary could be downloaded by the devices, which when they received a trigger to do so would check and download the new code. And the same with audio. You could put audio on the server and the devices would pull the audio down. The basic architecture of the system, this is a drone shot of the entire system. It wraps around the building, 720 devices wrapped around the building with multiple Wi-Fi access points, which you can see as little white units kind of dangling over the side of the building, and a central server running off a laptop that sent broadcast messages to all of the devices over Wi-Fi. So every one of these devices connected via Wi-Fi and running its own rendering and audio program for the light and the sound. So in one sense, this is a completely original approach to doing distributed audio in large-scale form in outdoor spaces or indoor spaces. And in another sense, of course, we've been doing distributed audio for many years, and this is a widely understood field. But this is a particularly challenging form of distributed audio because it involves separate programs running on separate machines needing to be synchronized. It also involves incredibly constrained technical limitations such as bandwidth for transferring audio files and processing power. So we take a creative philosophy with this work where we really don't try and view the system as a spatialized audio system. We don't think of it as an ambisonic system. We view it as a community of objects where each object is an entity that as part of a tangible interactive media work you can get up close to and interact with. We don't consider the entire system to be like a screen, so we don't consider those devices to be pixels, and similarly with audio. And we're also working with incredibly low frequency range speakers, so we're working creatively with that acoustic constraint. So we do try and make geometries move and create spatial movement and spatial arrangement, but we don't try and render spatial scenes as such. So we approach this by thinking abstractly about the ways that we might organize audio objects to work collectively, which includes these kind of broad concepts such as thinking of forests of sound, where each device is doing something similar to all of the other devices around it, but possibly with some random variation or very simple variation. But basically, you're looking at a kind of mass of devices all doing basically the same thing. And then a slight variation of that, we think of fields of devices where all of those devices might be doing the same thing, but we apply some kind of smoothly varying field across those devices to make fields of sonic spatial distribution. Or we can think of the devices as forming networks, where they're arranged in a network structure and they're communicating with each other. Or we can think of the entire system as a substrate, just like pixels in a screen, a substrate that renders some abstract content that exists in an abstract sense. So we've examined all of these things, all of these approaches, and the challenge here is to think creatively, but also in terms of the technical constraints and how to actually build a distributed computing system that could do this. So there's some more discussion of that topic, actually in a separate paper which came out recently in the Sound and Music Computing Conference. So I mentioned the extreme technical constraints. The SD card space is not a major constraint. That's actually quite large, 16 gigabytes. In fact, the biggest problem is actually the transfer time, because the ESP32s have very limited Wi-Fi bandwidth. And so transferring audio onto the devices when you've got 720 devices, well, the basic idea is we're doing sound playback off the SD card. So any audio we want to play needs to be loaded. The major constraint is the time it takes, especially when you're trying to do that in parallel or serial to multiple devices. So we actually ended up using more like 100 megabytes of audio, because in the time constraints we had, it was challenging to put more sound on. And that's the same with code. Sending new code to the device, the code is tiny, it might be a couple of kilobytes, but making sure that we can deploy the code to the rig when it's set up with 720 devices takes ages. So you really want to make sure the code is up and running. So the sound processing, even though the ESP32 is capable of a great deal of audio sophistication with a RTOS system library that we use, we did not have that system in place at the time to do anything more complicated than very basic, simple sample playback, no effects or anything. So we're just basically doing single sample triggers, but we can trigger anything whenever we like. And also the network communication latency and bandwidth constraints were such that you had to think really carefully about how you made distributed the behaviors work. So basically most of the behavior is running on the devices with occasional top-level programming, top-level messaging from a server telling the devices what to do. So these all make kind of working super creatively, super flexibly with the system not that straightforward. There's a lot of prep and thinking ahead about how you design the architecture. So these are some shots of the artwork set up. You can see that the devices are hanging there. They're just powered, so the cable is just there to power them, and that just runs 12 volts across and down, which in itself is quite a challenge to distribute the power to those devices. All of the communication is done by Wi-Fi. You can see that the devices are within reach in a public space. So as I mentioned, one of the major issues we face is that we spend a lot of time actually developing this stuff. There's a lot of R&D involved, and at the end of that R&D, it's still very brittle, the creative process when it actually comes to putting content on these devices. So we have to be incredibly restrained and also make sure we anticipate exactly how our designs will work. For example, when we arrive on site, we ideally get the system set up with a few days to go, because it's the only time we've ever actually stood in front of the system running audio. We can do that to some extent in the lab, but generally we only really get to do that when we're on site. So the purpose of this paper was just to reflect on our experiences of creative audio design. This was the first chance we've ever had to work with a 720 speaker system, but incredibly limited frequency response of the devices, quite low volume, and those constraints I mentioned earlier. So we've only managed to do the most basic of sonic experiments. Some of the effects that we found most impressive were very simple clicks that just had a kind of natural, tangible feel as they moved around the space, and putting those clicks through large reverbs, which kind of represented the spatiality of the system, but in a sort of forced way, created a really interesting effect. So here's a brief example of that. We also experimented with blends of noise. So one of the really effective things with a rig like this is if you put slightly different variations of a sound on each of the devices, then you get very rich spatial sensations. So just for example, we compiled about 20 different noise sounds, ranging from white noise to babble in a crowd, and applause and things like that. These variations on basically noise, mix them all together and spatialize those, and that was incredibly effective. So basically making clusters of similarly sounding but maybe diversely sourced sounds, very effective. We also worked with choruses. We made choruses of birdsong, and those obviously sounded like bird choruses with the added advantage of being spatially distributed. And very simply, as you saw in the video, we have a series of simple moving tones. And again, what we do to fatten that sound is to basically have the notes that make up a chord distributed across the devices. So there's a kind of spatial richness to the rendering of that audio. Another issue with these systems, this is the loudest one we've had. We've designed a proper speaker cavity this time. That means that the speakers are really working well. They're making good use of the actual speaker capabilities, whereas in the previous models we've actually had very, very limited speaker capabilities because we've worked within closed spheres. So these are very quiet devices. They're louder now, but in this kind of interactive spatial environment, that can actually be incredibly effective for design. So you create a system where from not too far away it's actually quite soft, but you can walk amongst these things, and as you move in, you can build interactive experiences where people get up close to the devices and hear the sound perfectly well. So in future work, we're actually going to be trying out variations of this, but using a completely different Pi-based system, which has the Pis have an advantage that they have much higher bandwidth, Wi-Fi bandwidth, much greater processing capability, although slightly less real-time processing reliability. Much easier to program because we can scaffold our code. We're not limited to the bare bones C programming. Disadvantages are slightly more expensive, although we're actually doing a distributed system where one Pi will control multiple lights and speakers. They have a greater power consumption and they have a larger form factor, but in the case that we're doing this in the distributed way, that won't matter. So thank you very much for listening to my talk. This paper was written with Anthony Rowe and Liam Birtles, but actually it needs to acknowledge a really large number of collaborators. So the paper's authorship is about our reflections of the sound design process, but it's not reflective of the authorship of Murmuration, which involves a large group of people, particularly Ash Wilk, Dan Pearson, and previous or current Squid Soup collaborators Gaz Bushell, Hannah Brady, and Chris Benowith. We thank Scottsdale Museum of Contemporary Art, SMOCA, for their support, and Kew Gardens and Salisbury Cathedral for their support of earlier projects. Also sound design by Sam Ferguson for the original Bloom work, and Eve Klein for the Wave work, and also Garth Payne for contributions to the Murmuration work. And we thank the Australia Research Council for support of this project. So thank you for listening, and we're happy to answer any questions, which we can do in real time, or you can contact me by email at o.bown@unsw.edu.au. Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Doug Brock, and today I'll be presenting Sentience and Place, More Than Human Cultures, written with Stanislav Rudowski from the University of Melbourne. Human society is undergoing a rapidly accelerating technological development, including general artificial intelligence, smart cities, smart medicine, and smart agriculture. Yet at the same time, the planet endures an acute environmental crisis as a result of humans' destructive resource extraction. Calls for more sustainable societies advocate greater care for the planet's ecosystems. This incompatibility between technocentrism and biocentrism will be a significant challenge for future actions. We suggest that a process of political emancipation that expands towards non-humans might provide an avenue for improvement. Sentience is one way to conceptualize and describe interactions with biotic and abiotic others. The concept of sentience is used in biology, psychology, philosophy, animal rights, robotics, art, architecture, and design. And in practical fields, technologists aim to build what they call artificial intelligence, smartness, or sentience into all environments, from objects to buildings and from cities to landscapes. The concept of sentience has been particularly important in efforts to protect biological agents, and therefore might also afford protection to possible future artificial entities. Future cultures will need to incorporate human as well as non-human stakeholders, and the study of human and non-human sentience, and its performance in concrete places, can constitute an important part of this future progress. Therefore, this paper asks, what roles might sentience play in future places? We hypothesize that an understanding of sentience as an inclusive, relational, and distributed phenomenon can promote more than human cultures, and therefore contribute to the well-being of broader stakeholders on the Earth and beyond. To test this hypothesis, we outline biological and physical understandings of sentience, contrast these with the interpretations of sentience in artificial entities, give an example of sentience in architectural design, and discuss how sentience relates to place. Unifying the discourses of natural sentience leads to a more inclusive, ubiquitous, and relational understanding of sentience. In nature, sentience is common, varied, and possibly omnipresent. This commonness can serve as a basis for the idea of more than human cultures. The concept of sentience is under active discussion. A common definition describes sentience as the capacity to feel, in contrast to reason or logic, while Peter Singer's well-known pragmatic definition states that sentience is the capacity to suffer and experience enjoyment. But while definitions help to outline the concept, they also require further explanations of additional terms, such as reason, feeling, or enjoyment. Therefore, an alternative approach is to instead look at the pragmatic purposes of sentience in research and practice. Many biological interpretations suggest that sentience has emerged in humans and other animals because it has adaptive value, which facilitates the maintenance of homeostasis through feelings and emotions. Emotions have evolved to guide cognitive and behavioral responses to improve fitness and survival, while feelings are experienced, positively or negatively, at different degrees of intensity or persistence. In humans, emotions such as happiness, empathy, fear, and disgust help to guide fitness-promoting behaviors such as resource acquisition, partner retention, predator evasion, and disease avoidance. This focus on sentience in humans leads to the conclusion that feelings and emotions require complex neural interfaces. However, other research demonstrates the existence of emotion states in many life forms. For example, zebrafish can have emotional fever with a rise in body temperature in response to stresses, while in bumblebees, dopamine rises to reflect optimism. Some researchers even suggest that plants might be sentient because they too respond protectively to stresses, while even single-cell organisms can reverse the direction of motion when they bump into obstacles or swim towards food or away from poison. A further step is to interpret all life and its evolution in cognitive terms, or even that sentience extends past life towards all self-organizing systems that can maintain self-identity. Meanwhile, the definition of sentience as the capacity to suffer sets an important precedent that links sentience to ethics. Animals' capacity for suffering is the core argument which informs efforts to improve animal welfare, but by contrast, the insistence on the absence of sentience in some life forms, and in all abiotic systems, can justify careless use of non-humans by human societies. The current discourse on sentience is increasingly inclusive, with the acceptance of sentience in other forms of life also growing. However, the application of sentience to abiotic structures is still much less usual. This paper seeks to emphasize the ubiquity of sentience. We propose that a more inclusive conceptualization might prove to be less prejudiced and more useful in the likely future places. An expanded and inclusive understanding of natural sentience leads to the possibility of artificial sentience, with similar ethical challenges. Engineers see artificial intelligence and sentience as realistic possibilities, or even as an inevitability. Some technology advocates admit that many of these expectations are fashionable exaggerations, while others predict human-like artificial intelligence within the next decade. Artificial intelligence designs can serve practical purposes or support the study of living systems, yet in both cases, humans create them for their purposes. Concerns for human safety dominate the discourse on the ethics of artificial intelligence. A range of ethical concerns arises from capabilities like autonomy, such as whether an artificial system might prefer its own integrity to the safety of human operators. Consequently, emerging ethical problems in artificial systems parallel the moral concerns regarding biological beings. For example, in some cases, designers deliberately aim for sentient-like capabilities because emotions such as jealousy, loneliness, and love can help govern and inform artificial systems' social behaviors or improve their decision-making, while negative emotions such as fear or pain can help artificial systems protect themselves. In addition to concerns for human safety, there's a growing discourse on the well-being of the intelligent artificial systems. Some worry that the acquisition of sentience by such systems might lead to a large-scale increase in robot suffering. These concerns about the well-being of artificial systems have resulted in calls to expand the confines of the moral circle, for which existing studies within the animal rights movements can provide useful precedents. The developments in artificial intelligence and robotics illustrates the tendency of technical systems to move towards autonomy, intelligence, and sentience. This happens in parallel with the increasingly inclusive understandings of sentience in biological and natural entities. These ethical conflicts of natural or artificial sentience occur in concrete places or habitats. These habitats have the character of highly distributed and complexly interconnected systems of relationships between multiple agents and processes. These relationships take the form of habits, traditions, cultures, and politics, which agents experience as persistent contexts and environments. Such contexts can be considered as future places. So, sentience occurs in concrete places with unique continuous cultures. Today, human activities affect and attempt to control all planetary environments. Artificial systems from infrastructure and agriculture to cities and buildings will become increasingly interconnected and automated. Consequently, all current and future sentient beings will inhabit partially artificial environments, because on one hand, sentience is among the declared objectives for such artificial systems, while on the other, natural sentient agents already populate most environments that artificial systems will enter or attempt to control. Therefore, the design and management of future spatial environments will have to consider many types of sentient agents. Governance and management of natural and artificial sentient agents will have to engage with extended ecological contexts and forms of sentience that are indigenous to these places. Here, indigeneity is understood as a form of more than human culture that came to a form of balance within a place through a prolonged engagement of multiple agents. These shared cultures within such environments create novel ethical challenges that require further study. In design, sentience is frequently equated with intelligence or smartness, suggesting capabilities of automated responsiveness or efficiency for anthropocentric purposes. For example, at building scales, reactive building skins are often described as adaptive, which typically aim to save energy or improve thermal comfort. At urban scales, smart cities, like the recently cancelled Sidewalk Toronto project, aim to achieve a politically acceptable sustainable growth, focusing on knowledge economies, digital technologies, and the optimization of urban services. While at landscape and ecosystem scales, the growing emphasis is on sensing and monitoring, where smartness or intelligence might address issues such as fire-smart landscapes or water-smart agriculture. Fully realized artificially intelligent or sentient entities don't actually yet exist at architectural or urban scales. However, experimental artistic installations can provide suggestive alternatives, including architectural projects like our own work, the performative architectural installation, or the series of experiments by Philip Beasley. In comparison to natural sentience, these architectural projects have both key similarities and differences. Like natural sentience, these works have bodies which consume energy, obtain sensory input, process information, and make decisions. They can have and express emotional states in response to stimuli, and they come into relations with other agents, which can strongly affect the social relationships between life forms, where sentience is shared between agents, and therefore, cognitive phenomena becomes increasingly distributed. Unlike natural sentience, however, these projects don't yet have sentience or general intelligence comparable to humans, and the forms of intelligence or sentience they do have not emerged due to intrinsic purposes, but rather have been specified by designers. Yet these differences don't mean that artificial sentient entities should not deserve ethical consideration. These types of structures are as likely to acquire general intelligence as other artificially intelligent systems, while abiotic structures such as rocks or hybrid formations such as ecosystems also don't have intrinsic purposes but still have value and deserve to receive protection. At landscape, urban and architectural scales, where interactions between agents organize into places, humans find themselves not only amongst but also within variously sentient beings. Existing artistic and architectural installations provide largely metaphorical examples to provoke reflection and future study, but are not really suitable as blueprints for design. Rather, they help to concretize the discourses of natural and artificial sentience in the context of places and cultures. A unified discourse of sentience reflects that it is possible to define sentience as a capability of all interacting complex systems, and that in living systems, sentience can act as an enabler of these places and cultures. An inclusive understanding of sentience as abundant and pervasive can play a useful role in future places by providing a more encompassing target for respect and ethical design. This alternative interpretation instead emphasizes that sentience is a process of expressing relationships rather than as a property of an entity. This focus on relationships privileges neither humans, nor biological non-humans, nor synthetic systems, but rather sees them as stakeholders within the common moral circle. We hope that the understanding of sentience as a ubiquitous capability can lead to more participatory approaches to the construction and management of future environments. So finally, we reject the ideological contrast between technophilia and biophilia, and we question the bias towards human-like qualities of sentience, and instead extend ethical consideration to non-human life forms and abiotic structures. We argue that an inclusive understanding of sentience can aid the development of more than human cultures.
Mattering public placemaking. My name is Cynthia Noury. I'll be the moderator for the discussion, which will take the next 45 minutes or so. And we'll be discussing with our guest researchers and artists, Adeilson Silva, Oliver Bown, and Douglas Bruck. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
So during the presentation, I'll do my best to keep an eye on the chat to include some questions of the public. We already have one from Philip, which will be included a little later. So don't hesitate to ask questions throughout the presentation. So before we get started, I'll just do a quick recap and introduction of our panelists. They all have very interesting and garnished CVs, so I'll keep it short there, but you can always go on the website if you want to know more and get in touch with them as well. So the first presentation we've seen was from the Laboratory of Front Poetics, which presented an interactive reality installation questioning and multiplying realities. And tonight we're joined by Adeilson Silva, who is a researcher at LabFront at the State University of Minas Gerais in Brazil. So welcome. And I know that your team is also online watching the presentation.
Yes, everybody's online here. If I can answer anything, they can answer for me.
Perfect. Next was Oliver Bown, who's joining us from Australia today. He's a senior lecturer and co-coordinator of the Interactive Media Lab at the Faculty of Art and Design at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. And he presented the creation process and technical challenges behind Murmuration, which is a massively multipoint sound and light artwork that was created by Squid Soup. So good morning to you.
Good morning.
Welcome. And finally, we have Douglas Brock, who's joining us from London. So good evening to you. And in his paper, he outlined Sentience as a foundation for local, more than human cultures that would have intrinsic value and help in the research for preferable futures, for instance, in design practices and architectures. And Douglas leads the Deep Design Lab and is an academic at the University of Melbourne. So to get this conversation started, we'll tackle the theme of this panel once again, which is Matters Mattering, public placemaking. So you've all been discussing that a bit in your presentation, but I'd be curious to know more about how you and your collaborators approach materiality with regard to placemaking in your work. Sound installation for Oliver, virtual installation for the lab front, and also in your design practice, Oliver. So I'll just let whoever wants to jump first.
I believe in the virtual reality, when we talk about materialism, we talk about the materials inside the virtual reality, but doesn't mean they are virtual. We are interacting with things that are not are virtually there, but they exist in that place, right? So as ideas and also other concepts. And I think this work, it brings this to the discussion. Even though everything, we're trying to understand all these aspects of reality, all this kind of new reality that we are trying to tension with all of these authors. But everything is just one big reality mixing with all of the other ones. So the material, talking about materialization of things, it's basically talking about concepts and also ideas. It's not just the relationship. Of course, we as a human, we have the relationship to understand and to decode objects and other things, but it's much more on the concept level. I don't know if I understand your question. If you can just ask again.
So it was how you, well, I think it was a really interesting answer already, but how you approach materiality in relation to the spaces you're creating. In your case, as you said, there's something both conceptual and material coming together into those virtual installation. It's not just something that's up in the air. There's also a physicality and a conceptual play.
Although this is a virtual space, it doesn't exist in this real world. We are dealing with the concept and we are dealing with the idea itself. So when we brought together all the authors like Smetrana and Oscar, they talk about this in other kinds of levels. I think we don't just consider this as one big material. It's multiple. That's the way we're dealing with this artwork. It's multiplicity of realities, multiplicity of concepts, and all these concepts, they connect to each other, and they bring this that we have now. We're already doing this. We are augmenting our world with augmented reality. We're removing objects. We're putting more information on this, and this is becoming our reality now. So I think we deal with materialism in a really simple way, I believe. This is just part of our reality today, as also these other problems that we brought here.
Douglas or Oliver, does that light up anything in relation to your own practices or differences?
A little bit. I should just clarify, first of all, I don't lead the Deep Design Lab. I'm a collaborator. So most of my work within that lab has been theoretical. But the lab is based mostly in the Faculty of Architecture. So a lot of the work we do is taking the sort of theoretical and abstract concepts into material reality, I suppose. So I think materials for us are sort of secondary to the more like technological side of the processes. So we have augmented reality as well, and use of VR for construction. I would say material sort of secondary within our lab at the moment.
Make it more central to your practice, or is it?
I actually think perhaps in the past it's been more of a focus, as sort of probably across the lab it's been a slow shift away from material and construction, I'd say. So perhaps the opposite.
Okay, great. And for you, Oliver, I guess when you get asked to build a sound installation for a museum, in the example of Murmuration, you go there one day, you stand by the wall, and then I guess how does your process work, kind of really building something that will fit into this space and create this idea of placemaking?
Well, I should also emphasise that I'm a collaborator in Squid Soup, so I'm actually really involved in that first stage. That's largely the work of Ant Rowe, who's the director, and Liam Birtles, the other co-author on the paper. But I mean, just to respond to that general theme, I think it's interesting for Squid Soup because historically their work has come from screen-based work, like most media art, the entry point, and my work from live music performance, and bringing this stuff into a world where actually the object becomes so important, the physicality of the object, has been a eye-opening and educational process for everyone to really make that shift to that materiality. And with these latest works, I mean, I know that Squid Soup, I wasn't involved in the physical production. I am actually at the moment doing a sort of parallel project in Sydney and getting much more involved. And you can see on the side lots of prototype sound balls and weird things that we've worked with. But the object becomes so important because that is actually what people are confronting, and the combined integration of the object and the media, the content that's being deployed, both in the individual, like the physicality, and I mean, all down to the details. Like we're in that work, we're using incredibly small speakers; they don't have high frequency response, so we have to work with that. But also, most importantly, working with multiples and thinking carefully about what we're trying to achieve there. And as I mentioned, one of the key sort of design philosophies we take is to really stick with that engagement with the object as an object and not simply as a rendering device. So we spend a lot of time thinking about resolution and screens. On a screen you're not conscious of the pixels, and in theory on a sound system, when you're listening to a PA, you're not conscious of the positions of the speakers and their physicality. They're supposed to be invisible. But that becomes increasingly challenging when you're working with experimental stuff. And then I think you imagine this technology maturing and then kind of shifting back maybe to some point where you can just completely abstract away from the objects again.
And then in this thought process, what space do you give to the experience that you want to create for people with those sound installation? Because certainly the perception of the space would change for someone coming to visit the museum, and that time the sound installation is there.
Yeah, I mean, this is such a new field for us to have these massive arrays of speakers. So we've done lots of sound-based work, but typically the sound has been in a more kind of singular high-end PAs that are doing that thing of just kind of projecting a field of sound into a space. So this paper is really like some very early reflections on what we discovered, and it's a multi-constraint issue because you can't just compose sound and kind of send it out to the speakers. You actually have to think quite hard about how about the technicality of how that sound is being rendered. So we're just scratching the tip of the iceberg, and the next couple of works we'll spend a lot more time researching what really is effective sonically. I mean, there's lots of interesting artists we can think to, and obviously lots of multi-speaker work, but this is a slightly different beast in its lo-fi nature. So people like the artist Zimun, the Swiss artist who works with very lo-fi, low-tech stuff like just motors that kind of tap against cardboard boxes and then repeated 1,000 times in a gallery space. And the effect you get from that is this incredibly immersive. So really importantly, you're hearing multiple points of sound. You're hearing, and this is something we don't really manage to achieve with loudspeakers very effectively unless we make that many loudspeakers. So that physicality of the immersion of sound in the space is something that I still think has a big future that's not really been fully explored yet.
Yeah, and that could contribute to also the experience of the people coming in contact with your work. I'm going to introduce a question here from Philip. It's for you, Oliver. It's a bit more technical, and then we'll get to talk about Sentience. So the question is, was there a certain power management through the network? Were you using the deep sleep mode with external triggering to reduce the overall energy consumption of the installation?
I have no idea. That's a question for someone else on our team. I don't know. So, what I can say is the ESP32 is a pretty low power device. Is the thing that ends up the bulk of the power goes to driving the speakers. So basically, when there's sound playing, the power draw is greater, and when there's less sound playing, it's lower. So I don't know about deep sleep modes or anything like that.
So that will be a question to forward to your team. So Philip, if you want to get in touch with Oliver, we can get a specific response on the reply on that.
Go ahead.
Awesome. So we had a question from Anna for Douglas, and then we'll extend the conversation to the rest of the participants. So Anna was asking, is there a difference between intelligence / smartness or sentience, and how should we understand these two terms?
Yeah, well, it's a very difficult question. I think intelligence, for example, is one of those things which has hundreds of different definitions, and so does sentience. I think you could say sentience. I mean, one of the key aspects of sentience is it has a valence. So it's like a stimulus is experienced positively or negatively. And that's not necessarily the case for intelligence. Intelligence can be much more objective and less experientially focused. And as for smartness, I think smartness is another difficult term, which sort of crops up mostly in a sort of corporate commodification way. And it's probably generally not particularly considered intelligent in the way that, so certainly not the way that humans are, or that, say, an organism or a complex machine is. But it's definitely different from sentience, I think, in that the valence that it's experienced with.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm sure you'll get more time to think about it and can continue the conversation with Anna as well. I was going to ask you, with regard to your own work, how do you kind of appropriate this idea of sentience and what does it bring to your work or your perspective that maybe wasn't there before that concept was brought into your work?
So obviously, with architecture, it's a very human-focused discipline, and all the sort of traditionally and still currently the thinking behind architecture is very anthropocentric. And so I began researching sentience, mostly just out of personal interest. And as you begin to learn about it more, it challenges the idea that emotions and feelings and experiences are human-focused. And so I think the main difference for me has been that it's shifted the focus of architecture from being a human-centered discipline to more than human, and a broader sort of the broader stakeholders which it affects, whether we choose to acknowledge that or not. And then I think also sentience, thinking about sentience in architecture brings in an ethical component too, which is largely missing from the vast majority of architecture which is produced now and historically. So I think, yeah, the ethics, the link between sentience and ethics has been a big change, I think, in that thinking.
Oliver and Adeilson, do you relate to sentience in a similar way as Douglas does, like going to the more than human, for example, or do you see it from a different perspective in your own work?
I've spent quite a bit of time thinking about things like agency, intelligence, but I've actually given sentience very little attention. So I found that a very interesting talk. And no, I don't really have anything to add.
That's great. We're there for that. I guess at the end of the symposium, we'll all have like a very clear reflection of like what sentience can bring to us and our work. What about you, Adeilson, and the work at LabFront?
Yeah, I think with the machines, we are augmenting the way we experience and the way we improve our feelings and everything, right? And again, we are always have done this. We're just doing in a faster and more intense way. And again, we I don't know, the other guy said, we have to be ethical regarding the things that we're creating and how artificial intelligence is dealing with new kinds of information, right? Not emotion. I prefer to think about just how we're dealing with the information and how ethical this is going to be in the future. But yeah, I think we keep doing the same thing that we just have been doing. We're just now having more power on all of those things. And of course, the ethical part will impact this even more now.
Mm-hmm. And this leads me to my next question. You were mentioning, Douglas, the anthropocentric view is very present in like architecture, but not only. We're humans, so we tend to perceive things from our point of view. What would be kind of tricks or thinking points for scholars or artists who want to kind of open up their perspective towards the non-human? What do we need to keep in mind, or how can we trigger that reflection?
Well, first of all, I think just very basic thing is acknowledging, accepting that everything we produce artificially affects non-artificial systems, and the vast majority of natural systems are also affected or affect in some way artificial systems. So there's this sort of a technocentric and biocentric divide, which is very common, but is not actually, I think, it doesn't reflect reality. So I think that's probably the first basic fundamental principle I would take for that. For example, we have projects within our lab. There's Dan Parker has designed a nest for a powerful owl as an architecture student. And a powerful owl is an endangered bird within Melbourne. And so that sort of thinking has meant that he's looked into the owl's nesting habits, what it needs from a nest, how many nests it needs within a certain area. So that's the sort of impact that change from human-centered thinking to more than human thinking can have on design.
Mm-hmm. And with relation, for example, like Oliver, to what you're doing with technology, do you ever have like those moments as an individual or a team where you kind of decentered your perspective from your own to kind of, bring technology forward? My question wasn't well asked, but
yeah, maybe
so what I mean is, this idea we were talking earlier about giving agency, for instance, to kind of objects or things. Like, what place do you give to objects in technology in your work as compared to other types of agencies, for instance?
Well, I do loads. At least historically, I've done loads of other work with agency and music performance systems where, so particularly in a sort of duet improvisation context, music improvisation context, and I mean, I think that's where the sort of subtle differences between concepts such as agency and concepts such as intelligence can be really teased out creatively. So I was using evolutionary algorithms to generate behaviors, very much inspired by some of the references in the talks, like Maturana and Varela, and so ideas such as coupling, and that proved to be really interesting in terms of bringing out a sensation of agency, even if it's a pretty on paper it's a pretty dumb system. It doesn't understand music, it doesn't understand rhythm, it has no programmed in or learned concepts of any sort of high level stuff like that, but still through the process that caused it to arrive at that point, which was an evolutionary process, which means that evolution is a really great way, and other types of optimization, search and optimization processes are a really great way to remove the artist's hand from the system, because and the famous work of people like Carl Sims, evolving virtual creature behavior is a great example. The programmer or the artist did not design those creature behaviors. They perform locomotion and swimming and so on. But they emerged. So you've then got a situation where the behavior of the system is out of your hands, and that starts to get interesting, I think, aesthetically. We've not really explored that much in this current work, but it's an obvious way to go, and particularly it's a natural way to go when you're dealing with the complexity of a distributed system, because computationally, top-down stuff actually, even if you want to do it, becomes harder. Emergent self-organized behavior is the obvious thing to do when you've got a network of networked interacting machines. So that just becomes a much more natural way to think, and to feed into the conceptualization of the work. Mm-hmm. But we haven't done that much of it. So that's probably going to appear back on our agenda when the right situation comes up.
Yeah. Oliver, Adeilson, would you like to react to any aspect? One of the things that struck me was this idea of the sensation, for example, of agency, or Douglas, you mentioned the fact that our idea often of sentience into architecture or their structure is still often human design to some extent. So there's that. Also, this line in the interaction with those other entities to which we can give sentience as well, or want to attempt to give more presence.
Sorry, I didn't actually quite understand.
No problem. I was wondering where you felt on the line. We're talking a lot about sentience or agency, but sometimes some work will be interesting because they give a sensation sometimes of agency, as Oliver was mentioning, maybe more than the thing itself at this state of the evolution of our practices and technologies. So I was wondering if you wanted to react on that or anything else, really.
I'm not really sure what to say on that. I think you can see the heightened sensory experience within Oliver's work. Yeah, I don't have anything to add. I guess the only thing I wanted to ask was whether he sees these projects as sentient. I think they could be considered that, but not really my domain.
Do you see your projects as sentient?
Is that to me or?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oliver, yeah.
Like I say, it's I'm wondering why now, but it's really a term that I haven't engaged with that much compared to agency or intelligence. So no, I don't. Definitely in the work we presented today, the squid soup work, no. I mean, well, at least at the core of it, the code in those things is incredibly deterministic and simple. So I wouldn't see there being enough complexity for me to start to think about it that way. In some of the other stuff, in like I said, the work where you've evolved something to and yeah, this work, like the work in minimal cognition, actually directly inspired this work, and that's basically, you know, can you evolve an agent with the simplest cognitive system to be able to distinguish a circle from a rectangle, that kind of thing, and arguably as soon as you do that, you're into that realm of sentience, and we were certainly doing that with those systems, and then putting them in musical contexts, but again, it actually whether their awareness of the actual context in which they're operating, the musical context, is whether that matters, is that meaningful or not. I mean, so the thing has basically been created, evolving in this completely virtual world, which has nothing to do with our world, and then you bring it out and you can kind of prod it and see that it responds. So I'm happy for that to just beg questions. I'm certainly not willing to kind of make a call. What I've become more interested from a design perspective is how do people perceive that thing, rather than, and that's kind of also from an anthropological perspective. Like, I can say factual things about how the system came about, but I would rather just kind of throw it at a sort of design psychology question. How do other people perceive it, and then sort of triangulate from there.
Douglas, you've been nodding quite a bit.
I would be tempted to say it's got like a degree of sentience. I think sentience shown to exist on a continuum of degrees, and I think emotions biologically are sort of seen as programmed responses to stimulus, and in that sense, I think, yeah, you could argue that artificial systems are capable of sentience. And then also the idea that I think you speak about your evolutionary algorithms, which I'm not fully across, but many researchers would argue that sentience should not be discounted on the basis of how it's come into existence. So I'm not sure if that interests you or affects you, but I would, I could think there's some sentience in your installations.
Do you mean you shouldn't consider its origins as being relevant to its sentience, or
not enough to discount it as not sentient?
No. I was going the other way. I was kind of thinking that by virtue of the evolutionary process, you'd be able to say reasonably concretely that it has developed these capabilities. I mean, related to that, I mean, and you talk nicely about this kind of hybridity and the human and machine, the kind of combined factors that bring something into existence and allow it to be sustained or to operate. So if you think of an ambient intelligence environment, that may arguably have some degree of sentience, but it's also important to recognize that that really only happens in the context of it being a hybrid system that's maintained by engineers, that's needs to be cleaned by somebody, and all of the things that make it not fall apart and break are are an extended system, and of course the programmer, the designer, the people who make decisions about exactly what that system might do, how it might respond, are all participants in that.
Thank you. Do you want to reply to that, Douglas? Otherwise, I have more questions from the public.
No, ask questions.
Perfect. So I've got a question, well-crafted and very clear question from Jess in the chat. And she asks, from the microscopic to the planetary, how can we think about scale in relationship to sentience?
Tricky.
Great question. Can we process that for a second?
So perhaps starting at microscopic, I think not many researchers, it's probably too far to say, but some researchers would argue that microorganisms are capable of sentience if you think of sentience as the expression of a relationship. So for example, I spoke about the microorganisms which are able to sense obstacles, turn around, or move towards something that attracts them. I think it's much more complex when you start speaking about planetary sentience, because then you start speaking about distributed sentience, and we have no agreed upon or accepted examples of distributed sentience in the biological world. So all organisms are seen as individual entities. There are people who would argue that I think it's the broader ecological system is one entity, sentient entity maybe, but I think that's not really widely accepted. So I don't think scale and size is so much an issue, but it's more about the shift from individual entities to distributed systems, which is a little tricky to start describing sentience.
Thank you. Any other reactions to that?
I might bend that question to my own interests. I mean, I think it's a really fascinating question. I can't think of anything particularly smart to say in response to it. But so twisting it, I think scale is a really interesting topic. I've particularly become more interested in scale as a theme in installation art over time, and being able to create works that operate at multiple scales has been a theme that's been very interesting for me. So you can see that to some extent in, I mean, any work that's sort of significantly larger than human size has that capability. If it's an installation, then you've always got that kind of interactivity with multiple scales. You can come up close, look at something in detail, and step back and look at the big thing, the big picture. And I've explored that in some different ways. So a few years ago, I did a work where people were interacting with a projection on the ground, but they were doing that in the foyer of or out the front of a building that was about 60 meters high. And so you'd step back, and the stuff you'd done on the ground would then kind of drift up in laser projections onto the building, which could be seen from kilometers away. So there was this real sense of the city scale, the local interactions, and so on. So I'm totally perverting the question, I realize, but
no, it's great. It's a different complementary reading, playing and navigating across all those scales. There's another great question from Philip. It's same at Douglas, but I think it could also relate to the work of Labfront. So the question is there, a decolonial perspective by engaging the more than human in the architectural practice of the lab? And he was asking that considering the colonial architectural imposition on spaces in Australia, but I could also see a parallel with the work that you did in Brazil with the virtual installation and bringing up this idea of like creating a new autonomous territory. So I'll let you both maybe react to that question.
Maybe just quickly for me, there is like a stream within our lab, I think, of people who are interested in Australian Indigenous knowledge, particularly how that affects the management of environments, and what we can learn from that in terms of architecture and design. It's not my area at all, but yes, there is a degree of colonization research going on within our lab. Unfortunately, I can't say a lot on that.
Thanks.
Hi. Yeah, on our case, maybe I think I'm not the right person to talk about this, because I did more the development of the virtual reality, but the first idea came up with Froiid. He was doing this action in the city of Belo Horizonte and shooting, making videos with this fake movement of emancipation from Minas Gerais. And because at the same time was happening, we are dealing with our election here. At the same time was doing the Brexit, and he was researching, this was part of his research on how these people are creating this and how the emancipation movements were occurring and how unreal was this from the reality that we are doing. And at the same time that it was so real, because although it was a fake movement inside Belo Horizonte, people were joining and people were trying to understand. And it is, I don't know, it's not totally related to the, I don't know if you asked about the architecture, but this was part, the state of Minas Gerais is, and for Brazil, it represents a part of our colonial system, and all of the historical cities are here in our state. So he was trying to play with this. And of course, it provoked this reaction, and also this starting to problematize this and all of these separation movements.
Okay.
I think if people have more questions with the concept of the work,
Yeah.
our other members they are on the chat and also on the lab front. So maybe they have like a much better ability to answer this kind of question.
I still had one for you in the meantime. I'll just do a small parenthesis saying there's less than 10 minutes left. So if ever you have any questions for our panelists, do not hesitate to just write them in the chat, and we'll try to include as much as possible in. But one of the questions I was wondering about, like this specific project at Labfront, is it was interesting in Douglas's presentation how we outlined this idea of like ethics with regard to the more than human. In your project, there were actually human involved that got in interaction with Froiid, bringing up this project of this new territory. How did that relationship go? Were there any ethical challenges, and how did people react to both his field work and the virtual installation?
When he was making the material, making the fake movement, people were just joined. Here in the center of Belo Horizonte, we have this public square that most of people, all the protests happens there. So at the same time, people were just like, this is just another movement. This is just something more banal thing that people are doing. So they don't, some people, they just don't care anymore about anything, right? Everything's so weird, and all that's a place that concentrates multiple realities, right? That's the main focus again. So they didn't have any kind of problems. You can just go there and speak. And some people, they didn't understand quite well why you're creating this separatist movement in the city, but they said, okay, that's valid. And after we developed this into a virtual reality, and we brought this into a piece of art, and we brought this into a museum, this was seen as another perspective, more then they understand that we brought, of course, more other concepts, but again, it was kind of the same reaction, like they don't care.
So Pablo, which is part of the lab front, the director, if I'm not mistaken, is adding in the chat that the colonial issues here are quite hot as a topic, a bit like you were saying. And I encourage you to pursue the discussion maybe on the chat on that if you want to know more, because certainly it's like a very interesting field to explore. With the few minutes that we have remaining, I was wondering maybe we should just go through each of you, and if you could tell us a few words on like what are the interesting avenues that are coming up in your work, either in regard to the panel's team or just more generally speaking. So maybe we could start with Oliver. Why not?
Okay, well, as I said, I think that the stuff we're doing now is the tip of the iceberg, and Internet of Things distributed artworks are becoming easier. We're doing our research to make it easier, to make it more creatively fluid, and these things scale beautifully. And of course, needless to say, AI transforming the way we create is hugely important too.
Okay, can you see just a word more on how it's transforming the way you're creating?
Oh, I mean, I don't think there's one single way. I think what's beginning to happen. I mean, probably just to sort of feed this into the other topics that we've had, is that we're finding this interesting middle space between passive inanimate objects and human-like or animal-like sentience. We're finding these machines that are incredibly powerful, but they still do behave like tools. We still operate them. We still give them interfaces and tell them exactly what to do. And that will, I think that will remain the way we do things for a very long time, but with incredible power. So, for example, getting something that might generate thousands of variations with structural knowledge and with kind of a complexity of understanding of some sort, and yet still it's a tool. You still press play or generate or change the parameters and that kind of thing. So this really interesting middle space is starting to emerge. I mean, has been emerging for a long time.
Great, thank you. Adeilson, what will we be looking up to for your project or the lab's project?
I think for the future, we need to become more, we need to be more intelligent about what we're going to do and more critical, and we need to be more creative. And this is what the lab's trying to do, I believe, because the world's going to become even more interesting. And more critical artworks are more challenging to do in this high level of technology, right? So it's really challenging to balance critical good artwork that talks about really big issues and use technology as a way to explore and to illustrate this, right? And I think this is what the lab is going to go with.
Great, thank you. And Pablo is also adding up in the chat about future projects for those who want to follow. And Douglas, what about you in a minute or so?
So I think the Deep Design Lab will continue our work on more than human architecture. For me specifically, I'm going to continue writing on sentience and architecture, but specifically or more in depth on the ethics involved. So I'm currently doing more writing there, and then hopefully I would like to get into some more design. My background is in architecture; it's my main interest. So I would like to take what I've learned from Sentience into some sort of design, but not really sure exactly what yet.
Great. We'll be looking forward to that, seeing the rest of your project. Thank you very much for the three of you taking part in this discussion. And thank you very much also to all the people who have been watching us and asking great questions. And I really encourage you to pursue the discussion afterwards. Each panelist has a profile online. So once again, I'm Cynthia Noury, and I was with researchers and artists Adeilson Silva, Oliver Bown, and Douglas Bruck, representing the work of their teams. So thank you very much for being with us, and enjoy the rest of the symposium. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.